The phone rang at 9:15 in the morning while I was standing in front of the mirror trying to fix the clasp on my mother's old pearl bracelet, the one she'd given me before she got sick, the one I'd promised myself I'd wear no matter what happened that day. My hands were shaking too much to get the clasp closed, and I remember thinking that was strange because I wasn't nervous about the wedding. I was nervous about something else, something I hadn't let myself name yet. I saw my sister's name light up the screen and I answered it anyway because some old, foolish part of me still believed that if I just kept answering, kept showing up, kept being available, eventually she would stop needing to hurt me to feel like she mattered. Margot didn't say good morning. She didn't say anything soft at all. "Don't bother waiting for Dad," she said, and there was a smile buried somewhere in her voice, the kind of smile that only comes out when someone has already won and wants you to know it. He picked me. I pressed my palm flat against the cool glass of the mirror. "Why would you do this to me?" I murmured, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how much like a child asking why the rain wouldn't stop. She laughed, short and satisfied. "You should have known your place." I stood there with the bracelet half-clasped and the phone warm against my ear, and I thought, for one terrible second, that I would be walking into that hall completely alone.
I was wrong about that.
I was wrong about a lot of things that morning.
So was she.
Welcome back. I'm Noor. I'm 31, and for almost 2 years I had been the quiet center holding my family together, right up until the morning my own sister decided that loyalty was something you could simply reassign, like a chore nobody wanted. I work as a speech therapist in a mid-sized town in Ontario, the kind of job where you spend your whole career teaching other people how to find the right words, and somehow never quite manage to find the ones you need for yourself. This is the story of the wedding day they were so sure I'd walk into with an empty seat where my father should have been. Drop a comment and don't forget to subscribe, because by the end of this you're going to understand exactly why that door opening mattered more than anything Margot could have planned. 2 years before that phone call, my mother had a stroke in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, the same house my father still lived in on Brindle Lane, the house with the wraparound porch and the maple tree out front that none of us could bring ourselves to cut down even after it started dropping branches every storm. She survived, but barely, and what came after was 18 months of therapy, relearning how to swallow, how to hold a spoon, how to say my name without her tongue catching on the first letter. I was the one who drove her to appointments 3 times a week. I was the one who learned the exercises so I could practice with her at home, because I was the only person in that family who actually understood what a damaged brain needed to heal. Margot said she couldn't, not with her 2 kids and her job and her divorce still fresh enough to bleed. My father could have. He was retired. He had nothing but time. But watching my mother struggle to form words undid him in a way he never said out loud, so mostly he sat in the next room with the television low, and I did the work. When my mother died 11 months in, quietly, in her sleep, in the same bed she'd shared with my father for 36 years, I was the one who called the funeral home. I was the one who picked the dress she'd be buried in, the green one with the small white flowers, because I remembered her saying once that she'd always loved that dress and never had a good enough reason to wear it twice. I was the one who chose the music, who wrote the obituary, who stood at the front of the church receiving line for 3 hours while people I barely knew told me how strong I was being. Nobody asked who was holding me up while I held everyone else. In the year that followed, without anyone deciding it out loud, I became the person who managed things. I paid my father's property taxes when his pension fell short after the medical bills. I handled his prescriptions, his insurance renewals, the leak in the porch roof that he kept saying he'd get to. It felt like love at first, being the one who was needed that much. It took me far too long to understand that being necessary and being loved are not the same currency, and that you can spend years pouring one into a family and still come up with nothing in the other. I didn't know that yet that morning 2 years ago. Back then, I believed if I just kept the structure standing, somebody would eventually notice the hands underneath it. I never asked for help because I was too busy making sure nobody ever saw me need it. That was the mistake. It would take a wedding to show me exactly how big a mistake it was. I met Adrian at a conference on communication disorders of all places, both of us reaching across a buffet table for the same overpriced sandwich. He was an occupational therapist, steady in a way I didn't know I'd been starving for, the kind of man who listened to a sentence all the way to the end before deciding what he thought about it. When I told him about my family, about the bills and the calls and the quiet weight of it all, he never once told me to set it down. He just made space beside me and let me carry what I needed to carry at my own pace, on my own terms. 3 weeks before the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table doing what I did every Sunday night. I logged into my father's bank portal and confirmed the auto pay on the homeowner's insurance, the one his pension no longer fully covered. I checked the property tax escrow because the township had sent a late notice the year before, and I never wanted to see that letter again. I refilled his blood pressure medication before the prescription lapsed. None of it was glamorous. That was always the point. The work that keeps a family from collapsing is never the work anyone takes photographs of. My phone buzzed while I was finishing. A text from my father, careful in the way he got whenever Margot had been talking to him. "Sweetheart, about walking you down the aisle, let's talk soon."
Soon.
He'd been saying soon for nearly 2 weeks. I set the phone face down on the table and pressed 2 fingers against the ache forming behind my eyes. Adrian looked up from the couch. "He'll come through," he said. I wanted so badly to believe him, but I'd watched my father avoid every hard conversation of his life, and a wedding, it turns out, is one of the hardest rooms there is. I should have heard the whole warning folded into that single word.
Soon.
Margot showed up at my apartment that Thursday evening unannounced, which only ever meant she needed something. She came in with both kids in tow, Theo, who is 9 and barely looked up from his tablet, and Daisy, who is 5 and immediately wanted to see my wedding shoes. My sister had been struggling since the divorce, the rent always a week ahead of her paycheck, the part-time job that never stretched far enough. I had quietly co-signed her lease so the kids would have somewhere stable to land. I never brought it up. She brought it up constantly, in the careful, resentful way people do when a kindness sits inside them like a splinter they refuse to remove. "I hate to even ask," she started, which is exactly how every one of her requests began. She needed $300 for Theo's school trip. I wrote the check without comment. She folded it into her purse, and then, almost as an afterthought, stirring sugar into the coffee I'd made her, she said the real reason she'd come. "You know, you've always made everything about you. Mom's whole illness, and now this wedding." I went very still. "I took care of things, Margot. That's not the same as making it about me." She smiled at me over the rim of the mug. "Dad needs his grandkids right now. You'd understand that if you had any." And there it was, the lever she'd been quietly building for months. She controlled when Dad saw Theo and Daisy. She had figured out, somewhere in the haze of her own struggling, that this was the one thing he could not survive losing 2 years into widowhood, sitting alone in that too-quiet house on Brindle Lane. And she had her hand already wrapped around it. She kissed my cheek on her way out, gathered the kids, and left me holding an empty mug and the cold, sudden understanding of exactly what was coming. I didn't wait to see how it would unfold. That same evening, I drove the 15 minutes out to my father's house, because I have never been the kind of woman who sits quietly while a disaster announces itself in plain sight. The porch light was the only one lit on the whole street. I found him at the kitchen table with the television murmuring low and a plate of food he hadn't touched. "Dad," I said, "I want to talk about the wedding." Plainly. He wouldn't look up from his plate. "It's gotten complicated, honey." "It isn't complicated. You're my father. You walk me down the aisle." He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle, the way he always did when he was about to disappoint someone. "Your sister feels like the family's splitting apart. She says if I push back, she'll keep the kids away for a while." There it was, finally spoken out loud. I kept my voice level, the way I do with frightened clients who've just lost the ability to say what they mean. "Then let's all sit down. You, me, Margot. Get it out in the open." He was already shaking his head before I finished. "I can't push her, Nor. I'll lose them." And I understood the trap completely, the way you understand water that's already risen past your knees. If I forced the issue, I would become the one tearing his grandchildren away from a grieving old man. Margot had engineered it so that any fight I made on my own behalf would look exactly like cruelty toward him. I drove home with her words riding in the passenger seat the whole way. "You should have known your place." I had known my place for 2 years. My place was holding everything up. I just hadn't set it down yet. My Aunt Pauline called the next morning before I'd finished my first coffee. She was my mother's older sister, 73, the unofficial court of public opinion in a town small enough that the church bake sale still functioned like a tribunal. "Noor, honey, I'll get straight to it," she said, which from Pauline always meant the opposite. "People are talking. Margot says you've shut the whole family out." "I haven't shut anyone out, Aunt Pauline. I'm getting married." A long, theatrical sigh traveled down the line. "Your mother, God rest her, would hate to see this kind of division. Can't you be the bigger person here?" I had been the bigger person at every appointment, every holiday, every 3 a.m. phone call for 2 straight years. There comes a point where being the bigger person simply means being the one who absorbs every blow so nobody else has to feel it. "What exactly is Margot saying I did?" I asked, and, because Pauline could never help herself, she told me everything. My sister had spent a week on the phone with half the extended family, building a story where I had grown cold and superior, where my career had made me think I was better than everyone, where I had been running the family like an accountant since Mom died, and now didn't even want them at my own wedding. None of it was true. All of it was extremely useful to her. "I see," I said. And finally, I did see the whole shape of it. If you've ever been the one everybody leans on and nobody ever thanks for it, the one whose first boundary gets called selfish the moment you set it, stay with me because what I did next wasn't loud. It was just true. Comment "I see her" below and keep watching, because on the morning of my wedding, a door is going to open, and I want you in the room when it does. Here is what made it ache the most. We were supposed to be married in the backyard of the Brindle Lane house, under the maple tree my mother had planted herself the year I was born. Adrian and I had spent 6 months planning it. String lights woven through the branches. My mother's good china borrowed from the cabinet she'd kept it in for decades, her recipe for spiced cider warming on a hot plate near the porch. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to be the person standing in the center of that family's land, the reason the day existed, not the nurse, not the handler, not the daughter quietly clearing dishes while everyone else laughed at the table. Just the bride. I had let myself want it more than I had let myself want anything in years. Margot knew exactly how much that yard meant to me. We had grown up under that same tree. She started circling it in conversation with Pauline, dropping it in like a seed meant to take root slowly. Funny, how Noor just assumed she could have the backyard. It's family land, isn't it? Not really hers. I told myself it was nothing. Dad had agreed months earlier, back when he could still say yes to me without flinching. But a promise from a man who cannot survive losing his grandchildren is not really a promise. It is a hope dressed up in a promise's clothing. I lay awake telling myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. I was simply early. The call came on a Saturday, 12 days out. My father's number on the screen, but Margot's voice clearly coaching somewhere behind him. "Sweetheart," he said, "about the backyard." I closed my eyes. "I think it's best we don't do the wedding here. Keep things calm. It's family land. Margot thinks." "Margot thinks," I repeated softly. "Now, don't be like that." I wasn't being like anything. I was standing in my own kitchen, 12 days from my wedding, listening to my father give away the one piece of ground that was supposed to belong to me for a single afternoon, because giving it away was easier than holding a line. I heard the screen door bang faintly on his end of the call. I heard a car pull into the gravel drive. Margot's car, arriving to make sure the job got finished. He hadn't even stood up from his chair to tell me. He'd done it sitting down, with my sister parked outside like a foreman checking on her crew. "Okay, Dad," I said. "Okay." And I hung up before my voice could do anything I'd later regret. The yard was gone. 6 months of planning, my mother's tree, her china, her cider recipe, all of it gone 12 days out to preserve a piece that had never once belonged to me. I should have felt nothing but rage. What I actually felt was the strange, weightless vertigo of something breaking that you'd been bracing against for so long your whole body had forgotten any other position. Adrian found me sitting on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, which is not generally where I keep my feelings. He didn't ask what was wrong. He sat down beside me on the cold tile, knees up, the way you sit with someone instead of across from them. "We'll get married in our own backyard," he said. "I'll build an arbor this weekend. I've got the wood already." It was a good offer. It was a kind, solid, true offer from a kind, solid, true man, and I couldn't say yes to it yet. The reason shames me even now. I still wanted my father. I still wanted, underneath every practical, sensible layer of myself, for him to wake up one morning and simply choose his own daughter. And I knew that saying yes to a backyard arbor would be admitting, finally, that he might never do that. So I said, "Let me think," and then I picked my phone up off the floor and refilled his blood pressure prescription because the pharmacy had texted, because 2 years of reflex doesn't switch itself off just because your heart has been kicked sideways. I was still quietly tending the roots of a house I'd just been pushed out of. Adrian watched me do it. He didn't say a word, but I saw him see it, the whole grotesque shape of a woman propping up the very people stepping on her. "Noor," he said gently, "who's holding you up?" I didn't have an answer. I had built my whole self around never needing one. I went to bed angry and woke up with a plan I would later regret. For 3 days, I rehearsed it silently, in the shower, in the car between appointments, behind my eyes during meetings I should have been paying attention to. I would print every transaction, every payment, every quiet kindness I'd extended for 2 years, and I would lay it all out at the next family dinner, like evidence in a courtroom. I scripted the opening line a dozen different ways. Before anyone talks about loyalty, let's talk about numbers. I imagined Pauline's face going pale, Margot's mouth opening with nothing coming out, my father finally understanding the size of what I'd been carrying alone. I wanted, so badly, to be seen that I could taste it like metal in my mouth. I was a single phone call away from doing exactly that when my mother, 11 months in the ground, stopped me without ever saying a word. I had gone out to the Brindle Lane house to collect a few things for the wedding: her veil, the lace handkerchief she'd carried at her own wedding 40 years earlier. The house was empty. Dad had a doctor's appointment I had scheduled for him weeks earlier without thinking twice about it. I let myself into the sewing room that still smelled faintly of her. Lavender soap worked so deep into the curtains it would probably outlast the house itself. On the shelf sat her old tin, the one with the chipped rose painted on the lid, and I opened it the way you open anything that belonged to someone you loved and lost. Slowly, braced. Inside, resting on top of the spools and pins, was her good handkerchief, monogrammed in the corner, the satin trim worn soft from decades of her own thumb worrying at the edge. And folded beneath it, a small slip of paper in her handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, the way she used to leave little truths around the house for whoever found them when they were ready. Asterisk place isn't where they seat you. It's where you decide to stand. Asterisk. I don't know when she wrote it. Near the end, I think, when she'd already started to see the shape of the corner her family would eventually try to fold me into. She had seen this coming long before I had. I pressed my thumb against that worn satin edge, the exact spot her own thumb had smoothed over 40 years, and something in me that had been braced for 2 solid years finally, quietly, set itself down. The folder of receipts sitting on my passenger seat suddenly felt like the smallest, saddest weapon imaginable. My mother had handed me something better. I lingered too long in that room. I was still sitting there when I heard tires on gravel, my father's truck, home earlier than expected. I should have called out. I didn't. I sat very still and listened to him move through a house he believed was empty. He went to the hall closet. I heard the door, a long silence, and then a sound I had never once heard him make. He had taken out my mother's old winter coat, the navy wool one she wore for 30 winters, and he was holding it, talking to it in a low, broken voice. "I can't do 2 fights," he said. "I just can't." A pause. "She's strong, Maggie. Noor's the strong one. She'll be all right." That sentence gutted me, not because of the cowardice in it, but because of the arithmetic underneath. He had looked at his 2 daughters and decided that because I could survive being abandoned, I was the acceptable one to abandon. My strength had become the very reason I got nothing back. I sat in the dim sewing room and understood my father completely, and I did not forgive him, and both of those things were true at the exact same time. He was a frightened, grieving old man clinging to the one thread he had left. He was also a man choosing, in that very moment, to let his daughter walk into her wedding alone because it was easier than holding a hard line. Human and unforgivable, in the same breath. I slipped out the front before he found me there. The gravel betrayed me on the way to my car, and through the window I saw him look up for half a second before his eyes dropped back to the coat in his hands. He couldn't even hold my gaze across his own driveway. I went to see Ms. Whitfield that evening because I didn't know where else to take the thing my mother had started in me. She had been my 8th grade English teacher, the first adult who ever told me my worth wasn't tied to how useful I was, on a day I had cried over a failed test. She was 76 now, sharp as ever, with a kitchen that always smelled faintly of cinnamon. I told her everything: the backyard, the folder, my father, and the coat, the note in the tin. She listened the way good teachers listen, without rushing to fix anything. Then she reached across the table and put her weathered hand over mine.
This folder, she said.
Who is it really for?
For them.
So they finally see. No, she said, gentle but certain. It's for you. You want them to hand you your worth, Noor. They don't have it. They never did. I started to argue and then stopped, because she was already right. Then what do I do? She smiled the same patient smile from 30 years earlier. You stop standing at a door that refuses to open, and you notice who's already in the room with you. She squeezed my hand. You don't have to walk in alone, sweetheart. You walk in with whoever already showed up. I drove home that night with the folder still on the passenger seat, but I had finally stopped thinking of it as a weapon. A different idea, a much better one, was already beginning to take shape. Word travels fast in a town that small, and the very next morning I got a call from a man named Walter Reyes, whose late wife I had spent 3 months helping relearn how to speak full sentences again before she passed. Noor, he said, voice thick, I heard your wedding plans fell through. We've got that old barn behind the orchard, the one we fixed up after Inez passed. It's just sitting there empty. I started to tell him I couldn't possibly accept that. You sat with my wife every single week, he said. Let us do something for you. It would mean something to us, please. I sat down hard on my front step. This was not a gift falling out of the sky. This was a harvest, 2 years of quiet kindness coming back to find me in the shape of a restored timber barn with room enough for everyone who actually mattered. I told Walter I'd think about it, though by then, I already knew. The family peace dinner Pauline had been organizing happened that Sunday. The folder rode along in my car, and I was still half convinced I would use it. The whole family was there, Margot and her kids, my father silent at the end of the table. Pauline started in before the plates were even served. We're all family, and family forgives. Noor, I think you owe your father and sister a little grace. There it was, my opening, handed to me wrapped in a bow. I could walk to the car. I could bring the folder in, lay 2 years of receipts out across Pauline's good tablecloth, and watch every face at that table rearrange itself in real time. My hand actually drifted toward my keys. And then I looked at my father, truly looked at him, smaller than I had ever seen him, a man who talked to his dead wife's coat in an empty house, and I understood that reading those numbers aloud would break him in front of everyone, and it would put me on Margot's exact battlefield, the battlefield of who owes what, who's the victim, who gets to be wronged. I would be making it about money and proof and being seen, which is precisely the game my sister would always win, because she had been playing it her whole life, and I had only just learned the rules. I took my hand off the keys. You're right, Aunt Pauline, I said, calm as still water. Family forgives. I forgive all of you. Margot's eyes narrowed. She had braced for a fight and gotten Grace instead, and Grace, it turned out, frightened her far more than anger ever could. The folder stayed in the car. I drove home and dropped it, unopened, into the recycling bin. I finally understood what my real weapon was, and it had never been paper. Here is what I did instead, quietly, over 3 evenings at my kitchen table. I built my father a handover. Not a weapon. A gift, the most honest kind I had to offer. A clean, organized packet of everything I had been silently carrying for 2 years. The insurance policy and its renewal dates, the property tax escrow schedule, the pharmacy refill calendar, the names and numbers of everyone I'd been quietly coordinating with on his behalf. I wrote it the way I write discharge instructions for a client going home to manage on their own, because that was exactly what this was. I was discharging myself. For 2 years, I had been the machine keeping that house standing, invisible the way a working machine always is. So I was going to hand my father every key to it, clearly labeled, and step back. Not to punish him. To free us both. He could not keep depending on hands he refused to hold in daylight, and I could not keep being the foundation for a family that called me cold. It hurt to type every line. But underneath the hurt was the same strange lightness from the kitchen floor, the feeling of arms finally remembering they were allowed to lower. I set the finished packet aside to give him after the wedding, then I called Walter back and told him yes. Yes to the barn. Yes to a room that actually wanted me standing in it. Moving a wedding in 12 days should have been impossible. It wasn't, because there's exactly one thing I'm extraordinarily good at, and it's organizing the unorganizable under pressure. I made the lists. I made the calls. And then the strangest, warmest thing happened. The whole town moved with me. My coworkers strung lights through the barn rafters on their day off. Walter and his sons hauled in hay bales and polished the old timber beams until they glowed gold. A family I'd worked with for years brought folding chairs without being asked twice. The diner downtown, where Margot had once interrogated me over coffee, sent over trays of cider made from my mother's recipe, because the owner had loved her too. Adrian built his arbor anyway, just smaller, and set it at the far end of the barn beneath a skylight. Every single call I made, someone said yes before I even finished asking. I had spent years being the person this town called when something broke, and I had never once understood, until that exact week, that I had quietly been building something all along. A net. A room full of people who would catch me the moment I stopped catching everyone else first. The backyard was gone. What replaced it was somehow bigger. If you've ever had to walk away from the table you were born at and build your own table instead, you already know it's coming, and you already know it was worth it. Subscribe now so you don't miss the door swinging open, because in 2 days, my sister is going to be standing on the wrong side of it. The room was full long before the ceremony even began. Margot simply didn't know it yet. She caught wind that I wasn't crumbling, and it unsettled something in her plan that had always depended on a particular ending. Me, humiliated, walking into a half-empty room without my father, proof to the whole extended family that my coldness had finally isolated me completely. A bride standing alone confirms every story she'd spent weeks building. But I wasn't going to be alone, and word of the barn, the lights, the cider, was already moving faster than her version of events. So she escalated. She told the cousins I'd snubbed real family by moving the wedding to strangers. She told Pauline I hadn't invited anyone who actually mattered. She posted something vague and wounded online about people who forget where they came from. Every move was designed to rebuild the same tired story, nor the cold one. But the people filling that barn weren't reading her posts. They were the families of clients I'd spent years sitting with, therapists I'd covered shifts for, neighbors whose kids I'd helped find their first real words. They didn't know her version, and they wouldn't have believed it anyway, because they had already met the actual me. Margot was shouting a story into a room that had already met the truth. I heard secondhand that her voice had started to sound frantic on calls, the particular pitch people get when the narrative they've spent weeks constructing begins coming apart faster than they can patch it. My father, caught dead center between the daughter shouting the loudest and a slow, sick realization that maybe the quiet one had been telling the truth the whole time. I didn't gloat. I just kept stringing lights. The night before the wedding, I did the quiet thing first. I sat at my kitchen table one final time as the family's invisible machine. I turned off the auto-pay on the homeowner's insurance. I canceled the tax escrow draft. I filed the formal notice removing myself as co-signer on Margot's lease, effective at renewal, timed carefully so no one would be stranded mid-month. I wasn't cutting anyone off out of cruelty. I was simply handing the controls back to the people who had insisted, loudly and often, that I had no real place at the wheel to begin with. Then I emailed the handover packet to my father, one short line typed above it. *, Dad, here is everything I've been managing for you and the house. It's all yours now, clearly labeled. You have everything you need to stand on your own.
So do I.
I love you. Nor, *. I hit send and sat in the quiet of my own small kitchen, 20 minutes from a house I'd kept warm with my own money for 2 straight years, and felt the strangest peace settle over me. You should have known your place. I did, finally. My place had been the foundation underneath all of them, and I had just stepped off it, on purpose, in full daylight. The house wouldn't fall tomorrow, but the people inside it were about to feel, for the very first time, the full weight of everything they'd been quietly standing on. My phone lit up. Margot's name. I let it ring out completely. Whatever she needed to say, morning would be soon enough. And it was. 9:15, the clasp on my mother's bracelet. The smiling cruelty in my sister's voice. You already know how that part went. So, let me finally open the door. The barn glowed like something out of one of my mother's old stories. A clean September afternoon, timber walls warm with string lights, hay bales softened under quilts, her cider steaming on warming plates donated by people who'd loved her too. I stood in the small side room they'd given me to dress in and finally clasped the bracelet myself, the one my shaking hands had failed at that morning. I had managed alone all day. I could manage this too. But alone, it turns out, is not at all the same thing as lonely. My mother's handkerchief was wound carefully around the stems of my bouquet, white linen against pale flowers, and my thumb found the same worn satin edge she had worried smooth over 40 years. The lavender scent rose faintly from the fabric and steadied something in my chest. Asterisk, place isn't where they seat you. It's where you decide to stand. Asterisk. Through the wall, I could hear them. Not a half-empty room. Not the humiliated silence my sister had spent weeks designing. I heard a barn full of voices, laughter, the scrape of chairs against old wood, the particular warm hum of 100 people who had driven out of their way to be somewhere on purpose. My coworker Priya poked her head into the room. You ready? It's packed out there. Standing room only. My eyes stung. Who came? Everyone, she said, like it was obvious. Everyone you ever showed up for. They all showed up back. I picked up my bouquet, the handkerchief, the lavender, the worn satin edge beneath my thumb, and walked to the doorway opening onto the main floor of the barn. Someone gave the signal, and the doors swung wide. There it was, the room I had been told, with a smile, that I would walk into completely alone. It was the fullest room I had ever stood in front of in my entire life. Not one empty chair. 100 faces turning toward me, every single one of them glad. The lie that I'd been abandoned died right there, with no speech required at all. Just a door opening on the plain. Undeniable truth. Ms. Whitfield was waiting just inside in her good navy dress, and she held out her arm to me. 76 years old, the first adult who ever told me I had worth, now standing in for every person who was supposed to and hadn't. You don't walk in alone, she murmured as I took her arm. You never did. We started down the aisle between all those glad faces, slow, the way you savor something you've waited your entire life to feel. And that's exactly when the barn doors at the far end opened a second time. Margot stood there, framed in the afternoon light. I watched her face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. She had come, I think, to witness the humiliation she'd spent weeks building, her cold sister walking into an empty room. Instead, she found the room packed wall to wall, the cider steaming, the lights gold, a beloved teacher on my arm, and not one single trace of the abandonment she had promised the entire family. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. And behind her, half a step back, hesitating at the threshold like a man standing at the edge of cold water, was my father. He had come on his own. No one steering him for once. Margot looked just as shocked to see him there as I was. I learned later that he'd received the handover packet the night before, and somewhere in those clearly labeled pages he had finally understood the full size of what I'd been carrying. Something in him had shifted. He stepped just inside the door, and then couldn't lift his head. My father stood at the back of that glowing barn, staring at the floorboards, unable to meet the eyes of the daughter he had let go. Margot found her voice then, too loud for the room, in the particular pitch the losing side always reaches for. Noor, this is ridiculous. You should have known your place. The whole barn went quiet. I stopped, Ms. Whitfield's arm still in mine, and looked at my sister across every silent, watching face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I finally do, Margot, I said, calm as my mother's old handwriting. My place was holding all of you up. I just set it down. There was no folder, no numbers read aloud, no receipts laid across a tablecloth. I had left that weapon in the recycling where it belonged. The truth in that room had never needed it. It was already standing there, visible in the shape of 100 people who had come, and 2 who finally understood why that mattered. Margot's "you should have known your place" hung in the silence, and the silence answered it far better than I ever could, because everyone in that barn could see, plainly, exactly whose place this had always been. My father lifted his head, finally, just an inch, eyes wet. "I read what you sent," he said, barely loud enough to carry across the room. "I didn't know, Nor. I didn't know how much," his voice gave out. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The man who couldn't hold my eyes across his own driveway now stood truly alone for the first time in 2 years, because there was no one quietly holding him up from the shadows anymore. He felt the full weight of the foundation the instant it stopped carrying him. Margot felt it too. I watched the understanding cross her face in real time, the slow realization that she had spent weeks fighting me for control of a man whose stability had never actually been hers to give or take. It had been mine the entire time. She had told me to know my place, and in doing exactly that, she had shoved the one person out of it who'd kept the whole structure standing. They had done every bit of it to themselves. I felt no triumph, only a clean, quiet sorrow, and underneath that, something steady. Ms. Whitfield patted my hand on her arm. "Shall we?" she said softly.
We did.
We turned away from the door, away from my frozen sister and my crumpled father, and walked the rest of the aisle through 100 people exactly where they wanted to be, toward Adrian and his small wooden arbor. Not one part of me looked back. Adrian was waiting beneath that arbor he'd built with his own hands, and when Ms. Whitfield placed mine in his, the whole barn exhaled into applause. We said our vows in a room that smelled of cider and hay and, faintly, lavender. I kept the handkerchief wound around my bouquet the entire ceremony, my thumb finding that worn satin edge whenever my voice wavered, my mother present in the only way she still could be. Somewhere near the back, I was aware of my father lowering himself onto a hay bale, sitting through the whole thing with his hat folded in his hands. Margot had gone, slipped back out the way she came, into the afternoon light. I let her go. I didn't have a speech for her, and I didn't need one. The vows were the only words that mattered, and they were about a future, not a wound. When Adrian kissed me, 100 people I had spent years quietly showing up for rose to their feet, and the sound they made was the sound of finally being seen by people who had been seeing me all along. The weeks that followed told the rest of the story. My father sat down with that handover packet and learned, line by line, exactly what 2 years of being carried had actually looked like. The insurance came due, and he paid it himself, late the first time, on time after that. The tax escrow, the prescriptions, all of it became his again, clearly labeled, exactly as I'd left it. He called me more in that first month than he had all year, and slowly the calls changed shape, stopped being about what he needed and started being about nothing in particular, the weather, a hockey score, my mother. Once, near the end of a call, he said quietly, "I should have walked you down that aisle." I didn't argue, and I didn't absolve him. "Yes," I said. "You should have." It was the most honest sentence we had exchanged in years. Margot's leverage came apart on its own, the way a thing always does once the structure underneath it disappears. She had been trading on her control of access to the grandchildren, but my father, standing on his own 2 feet for the first time in 2 years, no longer needed her permission for his own stability. He had the packet, he had the accounts, he had himself. The threat that had ruled him for 2 years lost its teeth overnight. She never apologized. People that far inside a story they need to survive rarely do. But the calls to the cousin stopped, and Pauline, who had preached so loudly about family forgiving, found she had no scene left to manage. I kept the boundary my mother's note had quietly taught me to keep. I help where I'm respected. I don't where I'm taken for granted. I still pick up extra shifts when a client needs me at odd hours. I still show up for this town the way I always have. But I stopped being the invisible machine underneath a family that called the machine cold. Ms. Whitfield comes to Sunday dinners now. So does Walter. So do half the people who fill that barn without a second thought. The family I was born into got smaller and truer. The family I built without ever noticing got larger and warmer, and the two finally settled at a livable distance from each other. Out on Brindle Lane, my father learned, slowly, to knock on his own daughter's door in daylight instead of waiting for someone else to make the decision for him. He's still grieving.
He's still slow about it.
But he comes now on his own, and when he does, he finally holds my eyes. My mother's lavender is still in everything. Her handkerchief lives in my dresser drawer now, the satin a little more worn from my thumb instead of hers. I take it out sometimes and read the note again. Asterisk place isn't where they seat you. It's where you decide to stand. Asterisk. I stand now in a room I built with people who chose me, and I have never once had to ask them twice. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Your place was never the chair someone else pointed you toward. It is the ground you decide to stand on, and the people already standing there when the door finally swings open. The shaking hands that morning. The bracelet I clasped myself. The door that opened on a room that was already full. If you've ever been the one holding it all up while someone told you to know your place, set it down, and look around at who's already been standing beside you the whole time. Share this with anyone in your life who needs to hear it. Comment below and subscribe for the next one.